Most people wake up each morning with the quiet confidence that life is more or less the same as it was yesterday. The room looks familiar. The phone feels familiar in the hand. The world appears stable, predictable, unchanged. Nothing feels different. And that is precisely the problem. Because while nothing feels different, almost everything is. The way decisions are made, the way attention moves, the way time disappears, the way people think they are choosing freely, these things have shifted so gradually that the change never announced itself. There was no warning, no countdown, no moment where humanity collectively agreed to step into something new. The shift happened silently, blending into daily life so smoothly that it became invisible. When something changes slowly enough, the human mind stops noticing the change at all. It accepts the new normal without resistance. Think about how a typical day unfolds now. You reach for a device before you fully wake up. Information arrives before intention does. Messages, headlines, recommendations, reminders, each one small, harmless on its own. None of them feel invasive. None of them feel like control. Yet together they quietly set the tone of the day. What you think about first, what emotions you feel before breakfast, what topics occupy your mind while your body is still catching up. This does not feel like a radical transformation of human life. It feels like convenience. It feels like efficiency. It feels like progress. And that is why it passes unnoticed. The most powerful changes rarely feel dramatic in the moment. Revolutions that arrive with noise and chaos trigger resistance. But changes that arrive politely, wrapped in comfort and usefulness, slip through every defense humans have. No one feels forced. No one feels threatened. No one feels watched. And yet, routines that once belonged entirely to humans are now subtly guided, shaped, and nudged by systems most people never see and never question. Attention no longer drifts naturally. It is pulled. Focus no longer fades on its own. It is redirected. Decisions no longer emerge solely from reflection or instinct. They are influenced long before a person believes they have decided anything at all. This is not a story about technology suddenly taking over. That idea is too obvious, too dramatic, too easy to reject. This is a story about technology becoming so embedded in daily life that it no longer feels like technology at all. It feels like the environment, like air, like background noise. When something becomes part of the environment, humans stop evaluating it. They adapt instead. They adjust their behavior, expectations, and identity without ever asking why. Over time, what once would have felt unnatural begins to feel inevitable. Consider how little friction exists now between thought and action. A question appears in the mind and an answer arrives instantly. A desire forms and fulfillment is one tap away. Waiting, uncertainty, and silence, once unavoidable parts of human experience, are slowly being edited out. This does not feel like loss. It feels like improvement. Yet friction served a purpose. It created space for reflection, doubt, and depth. As that space disappears, something else quietly takes its place. Speed, optimization, constant engagement. The day becomes full yet strangely hollow, busy yet fragmented. What makes this shift so difficult to notice is that it does not arrive as a single event. It arrives as thousands of micro-adjustments, slight changes in behavior, slight changes in expectations, slight changes in how long attention can rest on one idea before moving on. No single moment feels important enough to question, but over years, these tiny changes accumulate into a completely different way of living, a different relationship with time, a different relationship with choice, a different relationship with the self. People still believe they are in control because control was never taken away. It was redefined. Instead of being removed, it was shared quietly, invisibly, with systems designed to anticipate, guide, and optimize human behavior. The hand still moves, the choice still feels personal, the decision still feels free, but the path leading to that decision was shaped long before the conscious mind arrived there. That shaping is subtle enough to escape suspicion and powerful enough to alter outcomes at scale. The most unsettling part of this transformation is not that it is happening, but that it no longer feels strange. The mind adapts faster than it questions. Humans are remarkably good at normalizing whatever surrounds them. Once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. And once it becomes invisible, it becomes permanent. This is how the most profound shifts in human history have always occurred, not through sudden domination, but through gradual acceptance. If someone from a few decades ago stepped into the present, they would not be shocked by flying machines or robotic cities. They would be confused by behavior, by how often people look down, by how rarely silence exists, by how quickly attention fractures, by how much of life unfolds through glowing rectangles rather than direct experience. To those living inside this world, none of this feels extreme. It feels ordinary, comfortable, necessary. And that is the quiet truth at the center of this story. The transformation rewriting human life did not announce itself as a revolution. It arrived as an upgrade. It did not demand obedience. It offered convenience. It did not force change. It made change feel unnecessary to question. The world did not become unfamiliar overnight. It became familiar in a new way, one subtle shift at a time. Nothing feels different. And yet, everything is. And now, after a journey through invisible shifts, anticipatory tools, algorithmic mirrors, redesigned time, shared decisions, quantified identity, silent power, unconscious adaptation, and a future that quietly arrived, what remains is a question without a clear answer. How much of who we are is truly chosen, and how much has been shaped before we even notice? When attention, behavior, and identity are guided by systems we rarely perceive, what does it mean to act freely? Can a decision still be fully human when the options themselves have been quietly curated? Can self-expression remain authentic when visibility, recognition, and reinforcement are mediated by forces beyond our awareness? And if adaptation happens silently, without consent or deliberation, is resistance even possible, or does awareness itself become the only frontier of agency? The answers are elusive, not because they are unknowable, but because they are lived, not theorized. Every action, every thought, every glance contributes to a system that is simultaneously shaped by humans and shaping them in return. Each choice made feels real, but the landscape in which it occurs has already been drawn. Awareness may illuminate the path, but it cannot erase the invisible architecture surrounding it. So the question remains, in a world that changes faster than perception, in a life continuously molded by forces both seen and unseen, how much of who we are is ours, and how much has been quietly written for us? And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the story is not about discovering definitive answers, but about learning to notice the invisible, to recognize the shaping, and to ask the question itself again, and again, and again. Because in the asking lies consciousness, in the noticing lies choice, and in the curiosity lies the very human spark that even the quietest systems cannot erase. What will you see the next time you look closely at your own life? For most of human history, tools were silent. They waited. A hammer did nothing until a hand picked it up. A wheel went nowhere unless someone pushed it. Even the most powerful inventions remained dormant without direct human intention. Tools extended human ability, but they did not participate in human decision-making. They amplified strength, speed, and reach, yet they remained neutral, incapable of preference, prediction, or initiative. The human mind led. The tool followed. That balance felt natural, almost invisible, because it aligned with how people understood control. As societies advanced, tools became more complex, but the relationship stayed largely the same. Machines could process, calculate, and repeat tasks with precision, but they still required explicit instructions. They waited for commands. They responded to input. If something went wrong, the responsibility was clearly human. The boundary between decision and execution was firm. A person decided what mattered, and the tool simply carried it out. This separation reinforced a deep belief that technology was powerful, but passive. The shift did not begin with intelligence. It began with convenience. Tools started remembering. They began recognizing patterns. They adjusted themselves slightly to save time, reduce effort, or remove friction. At first, these changes felt helpful, almost thoughtful. A system that remembered preferences felt considerate. A process that anticipated needs felt efficient. Nothing about this felt like a transfer of authority. It felt like assistance. The tool was still serving the human, or so it seemed. But something subtle changed when tools no longer waited to be told what to do. They began preparing in advance. They started positioning options before the decision was consciously made. Instead of responding after a choice, they began shaping the conditions under which choices appeared. The human still acted, but the environment in which that action occurred was no longer neutral. It had been quietly arranged. This was the moment tools crossed an invisible line. Not when they became faster, stronger, or more accurate, but when they became anticipatory. A tool that anticipates is no longer just executing intent. It is participating in it. It is forming expectations about what a person might want, might do, might prefer. And once expectations exist, influence follows naturally. The tool does not need to command. It only needs to suggest, highlight, prioritize, or delay. The mind, faced with a pre-shaped landscape of options, moves along the path that feels easiest. Crucially, this transition did not feel like a loss of control because nothing was taken away. The final action still belonged to the human. The illusion of autonomy remained intact, but the starting point had shifted. Decisions, now began inside systems designed to reduce effort, maximize engagement, or optimize outcomes according to logic humans rarely see. The tool no longer waited for instruction, it waited for confirmation. Over time, people stopped noticing this shift because it aligned with a deep human desire to avoid friction. The mind prefers paths that feel smooth and familiar. When tools began removing obstacles before they were encountered, life felt easier, faster, more efficient. Questioning the process felt unnecessary, even ungrateful. After all, nothing appeared to be wrong. Tasks were completed, needs were met, life continued. Yet neutrality had quietly disappeared. A neutral tool does not care what choice is made. An anticipatory system does. Even without emotion or intent, it embodies priorities. It reflects values embedded in its design: what should be seen first, what should wait, what should disappear altogether. These priorities may not belong to the individual using the tool, but they shape behavior all the same. When tools start arranging reality, they become part of the decision-making process, whether humans acknowledge it or not. The philosophical shift here is profound. Humans did not hand over control in a dramatic moment. They accepted assistance. They welcomed prediction. They embraced optimization. And in doing so, they allowed tools to move upstream from execution to influence, from response to anticipation, from neutrality to participation. This was not a takeover. It was a partnership formed without negotiation. The most unsettling aspect is how natural this now feels. Tools that wait seem slow. Systems that require explicit instruction feel outdated. People grow impatient with anything that does not already know what they want. The expectation has flipped. Instead of humans adapting to tools, tools adapt to humans, and in that adaptation, they quietly guide them. The relationship has reversed so gradually that few remember what it felt like when tools were truly neutral. This is where the story truly begins. Not with machines replacing humans, but with tools learning to move ahead of human intention. Once that line is crossed, every choice that follows exists in a space shaped by something other than pure human will. And from that point forward, the question is no longer whether technology serves humanity, but how deeply it now participates in being human. At first, it feels personal. The content seems to match your taste. The timing feels right. The suggestions feel intuitive, almost thoughtful. There is a quiet sense of recognition, as if something understands you. But what feels like understanding is something else entirely. It is reflection. Modern systems do not simply respond to what people do. They study it, compress it into patterns, and project it back. In doing so, they become mirrors not of who humans are at their best, but of who they are most predictably. Every pause, every repetition, every moment of hesitation leaves a trace. Not a dramatic signal, just a tiny behavioral footprint. On its own, it means nothing, but gathered over time, these fragments form a remarkably detailed portrait. Not of intentions or values, but of tendencies. What captures attention? What provokes emotion? What is ignored? What is returned to? This portrait is not drawn to understand the human mind in a philosophical sense. It is built to anticipate it. Once prediction becomes reliable, influence becomes subtle. A system that can predict behavior does not need to force anything. It only needs to arrange reality in a way that aligns with those predictions. Preferences appear to be confirmed, not shaped. Emotions feel self-generated, not guided. Decisions feel spontaneous, not prepared in advance. The mirror does not distort by lying. It distorts by reinforcing. It shows people more of what already works on them. Over time, this reflection begins to shape identity. When certain ideas, styles, opinions, or emotional tones are repeatedly presented, they start to feel familiar. Familiarity becomes comfort. Comfort becomes preference. And preference, reinforced long enough, becomes belief. This process does not require persuasion in the traditional sense. No argument is made. No authority is invoked. The mind simply grows accustomed to a particular version of reality and slowly forgets that other versions exist. What makes this mirror so powerful is that it feels validating. People feel seen, understood, recognized. In a complex world, that recognition feels rare and valuable. But validation is not neutral. A mirror that only reflects selected parts of the self gradually narrows self-perception. Curiosity shrinks. Tolerance for uncertainty weakens. Exposure to difference feels uncomfortable, even threatening. The system does not need to block alternatives outright. It only needs to deprioritize them quietly. Emotions, in particular, become highly responsive to this feedback loop. Excitement, outrage, fear, and reassurance are all measurable. They leave clear signals. Calm reflection does not. Nuance does not. Ambivalence does not. As a result, emotional states that produce stronger signals are more likely to be reflected back. The mirror does not choose intensity because it prefers drama. It chooses it because intensity is easier to read, and when intensity is consistently reinforced, it becomes the dominant emotional register of daily life. At a certain point, people stop noticing the mirror altogether. The reflected world feels natural, self-evident, obviously true. The idea that it might be shaped feels abstract, even paranoid. After all, the mirror is built from one's own behavior. How could it be anything but accurate? Yet accuracy is not the same as completeness. A reflection can be precise and still be incomplete. It can show a person exactly what they linger on while hiding everything they never had the chance to encounter. This is where the deepest influence occurs. When the system reflects behavior back to the individual adjusts behavior in response. The mirror updates, the reflection sharpens, a loop forms. Within that loop, people become more predictable, not less. What began as personalization gradually becomes confinement not imposed from outside, but co-created. The system learns the person, and the person learns the system, until the difference between preference and conditioning becomes almost impossible to separate. The unsettling realization is not that humans are being watched, it is that they are being modeled, reduced to probabilities, interacted with as patterns rather than individuals. The system does not need to know why someone feels a certain way. It only needs to know when they are likely to feel it again. In that space, influence does not look like manipulation. It looks like alignment. When people finally sense something is off, the feeling is often vague, a sense of narrowing, a sense of repetition, a sense that thoughts feel familiar before they are fully formed. But by then, the mirror has been in place for so long that it feels like part of the self. Questioning it feels like questioning one's own preferences, emotions, and instincts. And that is the quiet power of the algorithmic mirror. It does not replace human behavior. It amplifies it. It does not erase choice. It shapes the terrain in which choice occurs. People still decide. They still feel. They still believe, but the space around those experiences has been carefully arranged to make certain outcomes more likely than others. The mirror never tells people who to be. It simply keeps showing them who they already appear to be until becoming anything else feels unnecessary, or even impossible. Time was once something people moved through. It had weight, texture, and rhythm. Days unfolded with natural pauses, moments of waiting, boredom, reflection, and rest. Attention followed these rhythms. It lingered, it wandered, it settled into long stretches of focus or drifted slowly without urgency. Learning required patience. Thinking required silence. Rest required disconnection, even if that disconnection was forced by circumstance rather than choice. Time did not feel optimized, but it felt whole. That rhythm has been quietly redesigned, not by removing hours from the day, but by slicing them into smaller and smaller fragments. The clock still shows the same numbers, yet time feels faster, thinner, more elusive. Moments no longer flow into one another. They compete. Attention is pulled from one stimulus to the next with barely enough space to register the transition. The day becomes a sequence of interruptions rather than a continuous experience. This change did not arrive as a demand. No one was told to think less deeply or rest less fully. Instead, time was filled. Every gap became an opportunity. Waiting became inefficient. Silence became uncomfortable. Boredom became something to be solved immediately. What once served as mental breathing room was quietly replaced with stimulation. And over time, the mind adapted to this new density of experience. Focus, which once required effort to achieve, now requires effort to protect. The ability to stay with a single thought, idea, or task is no longer the default. It is a skill that must be actively defended. Even when people want to concentrate, the mind has learned to expect interruption. It scans for novelty. It anticipates distraction. Attention no longer rests naturally. It remains alert, fragmented, and reactive. Learning has changed as a result. Knowledge once accumulated through sustained engagement, long reading, deep listening, extended practice. Now it arrives in compressed bursts. Information is abundant, but integration is rare. People know more facts yet feel less certain. Understanding is replaced by familiarity. Recognition stands in for mastery. The mind becomes efficient at sampling, but less capable of dwelling. Rest has changed as well. Rest once meant absence of noise, of input, of demand. Now it often means switching contexts rather than stopping. A different stream, a different screen, a different form of stimulation. The body may pause, but the mind remains active, scanning, consuming, responding. True mental rest becomes increasingly unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it no longer matches the pace the mind has been trained to expect. The most subtle transformation is how people perceive time itself. The present moment feels compressed, constantly slipping away. The past feels closer yet less distinct. The future feels both urgent and vague. There is always something to catch up on, something just missed, something about to arrive. This creates a low-level sense of pressure that never fully resolves. Not stress in the dramatic sense, but a persistent background tension that shapes behavior and mood. What makes this redesign so powerful is that it feels self-inflicted. People believe they are choosing how to spend their time. And in a narrow sense, they are. But the structure of time, the way moments are packaged, presented, and prioritized has already been arranged. When every spare second is filled by default, choosing stillness begins to feel like a loss rather than a gain. Slowness feels inefficient. Depth feels indulgent. Over time, this changes how people think. Thoughts become shorter. Associations become faster. Reflection feels harder to sustain. Complex ideas feel heavy, even when they are important. The mind grows accustomed to quick resolution, immediate feedback, constant motion. When that motion stops, unease follows. The silence feels too loud. Yet this state becomes normal because it is shared. Everyone feels busy. Everyone feels behind. Everyone feels pulled in multiple directions at once. Because it is collective, it does not feel like a problem, it feels like reality. Few people stop to ask whether this is how human attention was meant to function, or what might be lost when time is no longer allowed to breathe. The redesign of time did not remove hours from the day. It removed continuity. It replaced long arcs with short loops. It turned attention into a resource to be allocated rather than a space to inhabit. And because this shift happened gradually, it rarely feels like something that was taken. It feels like something that simply no longer exists. People adapt to this new rhythm without consciously agreeing to it. They plan around it. They think within it. They live inside it. And once attention is shaped in this way, everything else, learning, creativity, relationships, even the sense of self, begins to adjust accordingly. Time has not disappeared. It has been reorganized. And in that reorganization, human life has quietly learned to move at a pace it never consciously chose. There was a time when decisions unfolded slowly. A person encountered information, weighed it against experience, discussed it with others, and eventually arrived at a conclusion. The process was imperfect, but it was clearly human. Today, that process still exists, but it no longer happens in isolation. Decisions are increasingly formed in partnership with systems that operate quietly in the background, not replacing human judgment, but accompanying it at every step. Most people do not feel this partnership because it does not announce itself. There is no moment where a choice is labeled as shared. The decision still feels personal. The intention still feels internal. But long before a person consciously decides what to read, what to buy, what to believe, or whom to trust, the field of possibilities has already been narrowed. Options have been sorted. Visibility has been adjusted. Certain paths are illuminated while others fade into the background. This is not the result of a single design choice or hidden agenda. It is the natural outcome of scale and complexity. When the volume of information exceeds what the human mind can reasonably process, assistance becomes necessary. Filtering becomes unavoidable. Selection becomes a function, not a failure. The question is no longer whether systems will help shape decisions, but how deeply they already do. What people see first matters. What they never see at all matters even more. Exposure creates familiarity, and familiarity creates trust. Over time, the mind begins to associate visibility with relevance, relevance with importance, and importance with truth. This progression feels logical, even rational. After all, why would something be shown repeatedly if it were not worth attention? Yet this assumption quietly transfers part of the decision-making process to systems whose priorities are invisible to the individual experiencing the result. Belief formation follows a similar path. People rarely change beliefs because they are argued into doing so. Beliefs shift through repetition, framing, and emotional context. When certain narratives appear consistently and others remain absent, belief adjusts naturally. This does not require persuasion in the traditional sense. It requires exposure. The mind fills in the rest. Trust, too, is increasingly mediated. Trust once grew from direct experience or social proximity. Now it often emerges from patterns of presentation. Consistency feels reliable. Familiar signals feel safe. Over time, the system becomes part of the trust relationship itself. People do not just trust information, they trust the process that delivers it, even if they cannot articulate why. Crucially, this shift does not represent a loss of agency. Humans still choose. They still decide. What has changed is the starting position. Decisions now begin inside environments designed to manage complexity, reduce overload, and optimize outcomes according to certain criteria. These criteria may be efficiency, relevance, engagement, or alignment, but they are rarely neutral. And yet, because they function smoothly, they feel natural. The inevitability of this partnership is what makes it enduring. Modern life produces too much information, too many choices, too many signals for unaided human judgment to manage. Delegating part of the decision-making process is not a surrender. It is a coping mechanism. Once adopted, it becomes indispensable. People do not ask whether they want this assistance anymore. They ask how they ever functioned without it. Over time, the boundary between suggestion and decision blurs. When the easiest option is also the most visible, the most familiar, and the least cognitively demanding, it begins to feel like the obvious choice. Alternatives may still exist, but they require effort to uncover. In a world where attention is scarce, effort becomes a deciding factor. What makes this transformation so stable is that it does not rely on fear, pressure, or coercion. It relies on convenience and trust. The system does not need to convince people to follow its guidance. It only needs to make following it feel reasonable, logical, sensible. The human mind, faced with limited time and endless input, accepts this arrangement without resistance. This is not a future scenario. It is a present condition. Decisions are no longer made alone because they no longer can be. The complexity of modern life has made shared decision-making the default. The question that remains is not whether machines participate in human choices, but whether humans remain aware of how that participation shapes their view of the world. And awareness, once lost, is difficult to regain, not because the system hides itself, but because its presence has become indistinguishable from normal life. Identity was once something shaped slowly, through relationships, work, failure, growth, and private reflection. It was messy, inconsistent, and often invisible to anyone except the individual living inside it. Self-worth was negotiated internally and reinforced through a small circle of social feedback. Recognition mattered, but it was limited, contextual, and temporary. Most of who a person was existed outside of measurement. That boundary has quietly dissolved. Identity now leaves a trace. Actions, preferences, expressions, and interactions are continuously recorded, compared, and organized, not to judge in a moral sense, but to classify, to rank, to predict. In this environment, identity becomes legible to systems, and what becomes legible can be measured. What can be measured can be compared, and comparison, once introduced, reshapes how people see themselves. This process does not feel invasive, because it aligns with a basic human desire to be seen. Signals of acknowledgement, approval, and relevance arrive in clear, countable forms. They feel objective, even fair. Numbers do not argue. Rankings do not explain themselves. They simply exist, quietly suggesting where someone stands. Over time, these signals begin to carry emotional weight, not because they are demanded, but because they are available. Self-worth slowly absorbs this logic. Moments that once passed privately now feel incomplete without confirmation. Expression waits for response. Achievement waits for visibility. Silence begins to feel like absence rather than peace. None of this requires pressure. It emerges naturally when feedback is immediate, quantified, and persistent. The mind adapts to what it is shown repeatedly. Social value undergoes a similar transformation. Instead of being inferred through long-term relationships and shared experience, it is increasingly suggested through patterns of attention. Visibility becomes a proxy for importance. Consistency becomes a proxy for reliability. Recognition becomes a proxy for impact. These shortcuts are efficient, but they flatten complexity. A person becomes easier to evaluate, but harder to understand. What is most subtle is how identity begins to anticipate measurement. People adjust not only what they do, but how they present what they do. Choices are filtered through an unspoken question. How will this register? Not out of vanity, but out of awareness. When systems reflect certain behaviors more clearly than others, those behaviors feel more real. Less visible parts of the self gradually retreat. This does not erase individuality. It reshapes it. Identity becomes more external, more performative, more responsive. The internal narrative still exists, but it competes with its reflection. Over time, the reflected version gains authority not because it is more accurate, but because it is reinforced. Repeated exposure turns representation into reality. Importantly, this shift is not driven by manipulation. It is driven by structure. When feedback is continuous, people learn from it. When feedback is quantified, people internalize it. When feedback is public, people adapt to it. These are human responses, not failures. The system does not impose identity, it invites adjustment. This creates a quiet tension. People feel more connected, yet more evaluated, more expressive, yet more constrained, more visible, yet less certain of who they are when no one is watching. Reflection deepens not through crisis, but through accumulation, small moments of checking, comparing, adjusting. In the flow of the documentary, this is where the pace slows, where the viewer recognizes themselves not as a target, but as a participant, not as someone acted upon, but as someone adapting. Identity in the age of systems is not being stolen, it is being negotiated continuously, in ways so subtle they often feel like personal choice. And that is the pause worth sitting with, not because it demands alarm, but because it invites awareness. Identity has not disappeared, it has become dynamic, responsive, and partially external. The question is not whether this is good or bad. The question is how much of the self is now shaped in spaces that never truly belonged to the individual at all. For most of human history, power was tangible. Kings, governments, armies, and institutions held it openly. Influence was exercised through laws, treaties, or force, and everyone understood the structures at play. The rules were visible, the hierarchy clear, and the mechanisms of control comprehensible. People could see who wielded power, and they could, at least in theory, resist it. Today, power has taken a different form. It no longer flows exclusively through governments or armies. It flows through infrastructure, through code, through automated systems that manage economies, communications, and daily life. The structures are invisible to most people, yet they touch every decision, every movement, every interaction. Roads, servers, payment networks, recommendation algorithms, supply chains, they operate quietly, efficiently, and globally. Influence is embedded in the systems themselves, not in the individuals who designed them. The shift is subtle. No single event signals the transfer. No revolution announces the new hierarchy. It emerges gradually through the accumulation of capabilities and reach. Algorithms decide what billions of people see. Automation moves goods, money, and information across continents in milliseconds. Infrastructure channels behavior, not through orders, but through availability, speed, and convenience. The world feels seamless, yet every seamless interaction is a reflection of unseen priorities. Crucially, this power is largely unvoted. It is not derived from consent in the traditional sense. People use the systems willingly, often gratefully, because they work. Convenience replaces oversight. Efficiency replaces inquiry. Participation is passive, yet universal. The scale is unprecedented. Decisions that once required negotiation, debate, or deliberation now occur automatically, affecting millions simultaneously. Influence is exercised invisibly, without the ritual of authority, without public recognition, without accountability in conventional terms. This form of power is adaptive. It does not rely on threat or coercion. It adapts to human behavior, learning from patterns, responding to trends, predicting needs, and reshaping environments. It grows stronger the more it is used, not because it is imposed, but because it becomes indispensable. The more people rely on it, the more it shapes the landscape of possibility, quietly setting boundaries on what is feasible, convenient, or visible. The planetary scale is staggering. Economic flows, social networks, energy grids, communication channels, and financial systems are coordinated in ways that are largely opaque. A single optimization in one place can ripple across continents, shifting attention, behavior, and resources without anyone noticing. The levers of influence are now embedded in code, in protocols, in infrastructure that never sleeps, never negotiates, and never requires consent beyond initial adoption. This is not a dystopia, nor is it a conspiracy. It is a natural evolution of human systems in an age of complexity. The world has outgrown the old levers of authority. Centralized control by governments or institutions is too slow to manage the speed and scale of global interactions. Power has migrated into the mechanisms that sustain daily life, the networks, systems, and algorithms that act continuously, quietly, and predictably. From a distance, this shift can be difficult to perceive. Life appears normal, even orderly. Cities function, economies operate, communications flow seamlessly. Yet the influence shaping outcomes is no longer centralized, no longer deliberate in the old sense. It is structural, systemic, and inescapable. Decisions, behaviors, even aspirations are being guided by frameworks that no single person fully understands, and yet billions depend upon. The observer might ask, who holds this power? The answer is not a person, a company, or a government. The answer is the system itself, the architecture of automation, the design of infrastructure, the logic embedded in code. Authority is exercised not through commands, but through possibility. What exists, what is visible, what is convenient, what is fast, all of these define the choices people make, often without realizing it. And this is the paradox of the new power structure. It governs without rulers, influences without force, and scales without elections. People participate, yet they rarely notice the rules that guide them. Influence has become invisible precisely because it no longer requires visibility. It is the quiet architecture of modern life, shaping human experience on a planetary scale. Humans are remarkably adaptable. Throughout history, people have learned to adjust to environments, circumstances, and social norms, often without noticing the gradual changes in themselves. What makes today different is the pace and subtlety of adaptation. The world has become a system of constant, imperceptible nudges, and the human mind responds almost instinctively, reshaping behavior, language, and expectations long before anyone consciously registers the shift. This adaptation happens quietly because it feels normal. A change that occurs slowly, over months or years, does not trigger alarm. Small adjustments, replying faster to notifications, rephrasing a thought to fit perceived trends, prioritizing convenience over curiosity accumulate into profound transformation. People rarely perceive the drift, because every small step seems reasonable, familiar, and even inevitable. By the time the changes are fully visible, they feel like the natural order of things rather than a departure from it. Behavior itself evolves under this constant influence. Habits are restructured, attention fragments and rebuilds in patterns dictated by the systems around them. Time once used for reflection is now filled with microtasks. Even social interactions shift subtly. The way people speak, the words they choose, the priorities they emphasize, these are all being guided by invisible cues embedded in the surrounding digital environment. Communication, once spontaneous, increasingly aligns with patterns of feedback, recognition, and reward that systems provide, and the alignment happens seamlessly, without conscious effort. Expectations are likewise molded. People begin to anticipate speed, immediacy, and availability in every interaction. Delays feel frustrating, silence feels uncomfortable. Responses, products, or ideas that do not appear instantly are often dismissed, not because they are unimportant, but because the mind has been trained to expect continuous flow. Over time, this reshapes patience, attention span, and even judgment, producing standards that did not exist a decade ago. Language itself adapts. Certain phrases, trends, or formats gain dominance, subtly guiding how thoughts are expressed. Repetition and visibility make certain ideas feel more natural. People internalize patterns from the environment and reproduce them in their own speech, writing, and thinking, often unconsciously. The system's influence becomes embedded within the very tools humans use to articulate themselves, making adaptation feel self-directed even when it is externally guided. The most profound aspect of this adaptation is its invisibility. Because the process occurs incrementally, humans perceive continuity rather than change. Every adjustment feels logical, convenient, and voluntary. People adapt, not out of coercion or compulsion, but because the environment suggests that adaptation is the natural response. By the time someone notices a shift, it is no longer a departure from the old, but the new normal. This is the essence of adaptation without awareness. Humans remain in control, but the landscape of control has changed. Decisions, behaviors, and even identities are subtly tuned to match the patterns the environment presents. Adaptation is not optional. It is embedded in daily existence. And because it feels normal, the very changes that redefine human life pass largely unexamined. The result is a world where people are both actors and respondents in a system they barely perceive. Every glance, every gesture, every thought is influenced by a complex mesh of cues and nudges, and yet it all feels intuitive. Humans adapt not because they are forced to, but because adaptation has become the path of least resistance. The quiet, continuous reshaping of behavior ensures that the system evolves alongside those it influences, while those individuals remain unaware of just how profoundly they have changed. In this way, the human mind becomes its own instrument of adaptation, accepting, normalizing, and perpetuating the very changes that it barely notices. This silent cooperation between human cognition and environmental design is what allows transformation to occur at scale, without drama, without revolt, and without conscious consent. And it is in this seamless adjustment that the most significant changes to human life are happening unseen, unquestioned, and remarkably resilient. The future, as most people imagine it, is dramatic. It is something that arrives suddenly, shiny, unfamiliar, and unmistakable. People picture flying cars, towering cities, or machines that speak like humans. They wait for a moment, a threshold, a clear line between the world that was and the world that is. And yet, the reality is far subtler. The future did not announce itself with a spectacle. It arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, blending into the daily lives of billions. Look around. Technology touches almost every moment, yet it no longer feels new. It has woven itself into routines, decisions, and relationships. Phones that anticipate needs, systems that guide behavior, networks that coordinate life across continents. All of these are not signs of tomorrow. They are the present, fully operational and already shaping how people think, act, and connect. The future did not crash into the past. It seeped into it, unnoticed, until the difference became invisible. The emotional weight of this realization is striking. People imagine progress as sudden and external, something to be admired or feared at a distance. But the true transformation is internal, intimate, and immediate. Habits, expectations, social norms, even identity itself, all have been quietly restructured by forces so subtle that they feel normal, inevitable, and unavoidable. What once would have seemed futuristic now feels ordinary, almost mundane. The extraordinary has been normalized. This is why understanding the present is so urgent. Waiting for the future to arrive is futile, because it is already here. The shifts are not happening in some distant laboratory or boardroom. They are unfolding in homes, streets, and workplaces around the globe. The world people inhabit is both familiar and alien, comforting and unsettling, functional and quietly transformative. Every notification, recommendation, and micro-interaction carries the weight of this new reality, shaping experience in ways that are immediately lived but rarely examined. Perhaps the most surprising aspect is how seamlessly adaptation has occurred. People believe they are living their own lives, yet the patterns of behavior, expectation, and attention have been preconditioned by systems operating invisibly. The future did not force itself upon humanity. It coaxed, suggested, and nudged its way into existence, blending with habits, desires, and routines until resistance felt unnecessary and change felt normal. The quiet arrival of the future also reframes urgency. There is no longer a distant point to prepare for. The landscape has shifted beneath everyone's feet, and the measure of readiness is no longer about mastering new tools or technologies. It is about awareness, recognizing that the world has changed, that systems already shape behavior, and that life now operates under new rhythms is the only way to engage consciously with the forces that guide human experience. This is the emotional peak of realization. The story is not about tomorrow. It is not about speculation or prediction. The story is about now. The shifts that feel invisible, gradual, and natural are the future lived in real time. What feels ordinary has been extraordinary all along. What feels convenient has been transformative all along. And the quiet truth is that humanity is already inside a world that was imagined only in dreams, but which arrived so softly that most people never noticed. The future did not arrive with a bang. It arrived